All right.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, why don't we get started? I'm Alex Wendt of the Ohio State University, and I just wanted to begin by welcoming you all to the third annual Bootcamp in Quantum Social Science, which is being generously funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and hosted, albeit virtually, by the Mershon Center for International Security here at OSU, which is where I have a joint appointment. So in this 30-minute introduction, what I want to do is just some introductions of personnel, then talk about the idea of the camp and what we're trying to do to realize it, and then end with various logistics and procedural comments. And I should point out that all the sessions at the camp will be recorded and should be available relatively soon after the camp is over. So there's no need to scribble down everything. You can always come back and watch the videos later. Okay, so let me start with the team. And I'm joined as host by two colleagues. The first is Zheng or Joyce Wang, who's a professor at OSU School of Communications, which happens to be one of the top programs in the country, it turns out. Joyce was an early pioneer in quantum decision theory for at least 15 years now, and is still a prolific contributor to this literature, which she knows inside and out, certainly. And then my other co-conspirator is Michael Schnabel, who is a research professor in political science at Vanderbilt University. And he trained in his PhD program in physics and neuroscience, but he is now transitioning to becoming a social or a cognitive scientist. Not clear why he would do that, but that's what he's doing. And then there's me. I'm a political scientist with a nominal specialization in international relations, or what we call IR, and you'll hear the phrase IR at various times this week. That's international relations. But most of my work is philosophical in character. And in 2015, I published a book with Cambridge, Quantum Mind and Social Science. Let's see if I have that. Oh, I do. There's my book, which is a purely conceptual, qualitative treatment of quantum theory and how it relates to social science. So unlike Joyce and Michael, I don't know the math. I do what I can without the math, but that's more of a philosophical take than a technical take. Okay. Then in addition, so those are the core members of the team. Then this year we have two additional faculty members. One is Natasha Mautner, is how it's pronounced, Mautner, who is a professor of social science philosophy and method at Newcastle University, basically a methodologist, philosophy of social science kind of thing. And she'll be leading an afternoon workshop Monday and Tuesday on qualitative methods informed by Karen Barad's approach to quantum theory. And I'll say a bit more about Natasha's seminar a little bit later. And then finally, on the faculty side, we have Jakub Tesar, who's a political scientist at Charles University in Prague. And he trained in his PhD in IR and quantum theory. And he's basically a quantum game theorist. And he will be leading with Michael, co-leading an afternoon workshop paralleling Natasha's, but this one on formal theory and quantitative methods. So we have one qualitative workshop this afternoon in the afternoons and one quantitative one. And then we have staff. We have three staff, actually. Danny Wollerman and Andrew McKay are kind of in the background for your purposes. But a key figure here is Kelly Whitaker, because she is controlling the Zoom and all the technical stuff, and is basically there to keep me on track because technology is not my friend. And so Kelly plays a crucial role. If you need to contact, if you any kind of questions about logistics or anything that you're dealing with, just send her a message through the chat function, and the message will eventually get to her. Okay, so a few words about you, since you can't see who's sitting next to you in this workshop or how many of you there are and so on. So just a few things that I would say. First of all, by the numbers overall, as of Friday, we had 166 unique registrations. We'll probably end up with somewhat more than that by the end of this week. By field, I actually forgot to break the numbers down in a way that I can present them to you. I do know from looking at the numbers that the plurality of this group are political scientists and IR people. Not too surprising, but the other primary social sciences, sociology, economics, anthropology, and so on, these are all well represented in the group. And then there's probably another 15 or even 20 smaller disciplines that people have indicated that they were part of. So it's an extremely diverse field. Your group is extremely diverse intellectually. Then also by cohort, just like last year, the group is weighted toward younger scholars. And in fact, 40% of you are faculty and 60% are postdocs and below. And with grad students making up about a quarter by themselves, just the grad student category. But there are actually 12% of undergraduates in this group and several students in high school that I've been corresponding with. So it's a very young group, and that's exactly what we want, because this whole boot camp is really aimed at what we call new investigators as opposed to seasoned veterans, okay? And then finally, just looking at you guys from the point of view of how much background you have, about 2/3 said in the survey that you had no background at all or were beginners. And that's the same proportion that we had the last 2 years as well, actually. Then 1/3 said intermediate or advanced. So again, this is what we want to see for young investigators. The fact that you don't have much background is not a problem at all. Now, I will say, though, that this diversity, this intellectual and background diversity, it is challenging for our speakers because they have to figure out how to calibrate their talks to an extremely diverse audience. So they know what they're getting into. We've talked about the nature of this enterprise with them. And I know that each in their own way will try as hard as they can to reach as many of you as possible. But there's no guarantees, of course, for everybody. But that's just the way these things go. And moreover, as it has been famously said, after all, no one really understands quantum theory. So in a sense, we are all beginners, not just the real beginners. And actually, speaking about beginners, just a side note, this material and the lectures can be very challenging, very difficult. And it is often said, of course, that quantum theory is counterintuitive or paradoxical. But in my view, that's only true if we're talking about material objects like pulleys and chairs. If we're talking about people, and especially minds, their minds, then I hope that you'll see by the end of this week that the quantum approach is actually very intuitive, and it's the classical approach that's, in fact, counterintuitive. That's if you can sort of calibrate your brain correctly, so to speak, in this workshop. Bottom line is, if you are getting lost, don't worry about it. This is an immersion experience. A lot of it may only become clear or even semi-clear well after the fact. So just hang in there and it'll be fun. Okay, a few words about our speakers. I'll save all the individual introductions for when I actually introduce their talks. But I did want to say a few words about them collectively. So we have 10 speakers across the week, 2 each morning. Some of them are among the founders of their fields. All are tremendously good at what they do. We know their work well. We're very excited to have. This is just an amazing group of speakers, just like we had last year and the year before. And that's one advantage of the online format. But we'll get back to that in a second. Now, but of the speakers, almost all of them are quantum theorists. All but one, I would say, would probably call themselves that. And in that sense, they all speak the same language. But it is I think you'll be surprised, nevertheless, at how different their approaches to this literature and these questions are. And in fact, I see sort of a basic division in this whole group and in the field as a whole between scientists and scholars who are more interested in cognition, quantum cognition, and then there's the other group that is more interested in consciousness. And those are clearly related, but scholars tend to sort of go one direction or the other. Consciousness takes us in a more subjective, experiential, phenomenological direction. Cognition takes us in a more mechanistic, maybe more positivist direction, and so on. So these are 2 different directions in the literature, and they don't always speak to each other. But some of the talks, both talks today have consciousness front and center. Later in the week, they'll be more cognition centric. But that's just kind of a very crude distinction in the literature as a whole. You'll see it, I think, over the course of the next few days. But the big takeaway from all our speakers for the week is that quantum social science is, I think anyway, it is a thing, but it is not one thing. It's lots of different things, lots of different versions of the idea of quantum social science. And the beauty of it is that it's united, all these different approaches are united by a very precise mathematical language and a relatively precise conceptual language too, which has been, the concepts have been well worked out for almost a century now. So in that sense, even though people are coming at this from very different points of view, having a common framework makes a conversation possible because we're all speaking the same language more or less, although we'll get hung up on the language too, as you'll see. But okay. So let me say a few words about the idea of the camp, starting with the context. So over the past 15 years or so, there's been a lot of work, scholarship at the intersection of quantum theory and especially cognitive science, and then from cognitive science branching out into other domains from there. And basically this research consists of quantizing, what's called quantizing, existing cognitive science findings, existing theories, existing results, and so on, and swapping out the classical assumption in the existing literature, the classical assumptions in the existing literature, and then putting quantum ones in their place. And then we get new models, new predictions, and then these scholars are then testing their predictions against especially psychological data. And what this work has found is that a quantum framework resolves, I think pretty decisively, long-standing anomalies in cognitive science, especially the so-called complementarity anomalies. And it not only does it resolve these anomalies, but the quantum approach does so in a unified, axiomatically well-founded way. And I think this is a remarkable achievement, especially in social science, which advances, one inch at a time. It's a remarkable achievement to sort of simultaneously eliminate a whole bunch of anomalies that have been bothering scholars for several decades. If Daniel Kahneman gets the Nobel Prize in economics, which he did, for discovering these anomalies or being one of the leaders, I would say that quantum decision theorists and quantum cognition people should share a Nobel Prize for explaining them, and then it will all be complete. And the other thing I would say about this sort of in this opening comment here is that the success of all this research, the quantum cognition research in particular, is very surprising because for decades it's been assumed that quantum theory is mostly relevant only at the subatomic level, more or less. And that anything above that level, at some point, old-fashioned classical physics takes over. And this is all because of a phenomenon called decoherence, which you'll hear about at various points in various lectures this week, I'm sure. But decoherence is the moment when quantum phenomena, so-called, collapse into classical phenomena. And as a result of this collapse, this decoherence idea, social scientists who are working at the macro level, because we don't deal with subatomic particles in social science, obviously, social scientists, my colleagues and I, have always been trained purely in classical methods, classical logic, classical probability theory, classical game theory, and so on. Classical assumptions up and down, classical ontology everywhere. And this training, I would say, this classical training is so deeply rooted that quantum alternatives are not even mentioned. I think many colleagues have never even heard of quantum social science. And so it's just classical all the time without a kind of a question mark. So the problem with this then is, though, that because people, I think a lot of people and scientific community in general has assumed that quantum theory is mostly just for physicists, and that's beginning to change, but it's mostly just for physicists. One result of that is that very few people study physics, especially quantum physics, in college, at the undergraduate level. And that in turn has a downstream effect, which means that very few people enter social science grad school with any awareness of quantum ideas, much less any real knowledge of quantum theory. And by then, it's really too late to learn, because the math and the logic and the whole conceptual framework is so different from what we've been taught up to that point, all these classical conceptions of statistics and so on, that even my most sophisticated colleagues, professor colleagues, most technically sophisticated, methodologically sophisticated, the most sophisticated ones cannot read basic quantum equations because the notation is different and the concepts are different. So it really is a different language. for even very, very skilled scholars. So in short, the problem that I'm identifying is really a supply chain problem or a pipeline problem, that there are not enough people in the pipeline from undergraduate into graduate school and beyond to take advantage of all the, I think, very easy pickings for articles and so on that are out there in this field. Okay, so we can't fix a global deficit in undergraduate education at all, this group and so on. But what we can do, I think, is to help jumpstart more quantum social science work by creating a camp where students with no prior background or very little background can be introduced to a quantum perspective, both on the quantitative mathematical side, but also on the conceptual philosophical side. So both halves, we think are important. And then after the camp is over, our hope is that you, the participants, will have learned at least enough to begin teaching yourselves and knowing where to go to get more help and so on. So it's just kind of to jumpstart everything going. So the original idea for the camp was a 2-week residential camp, which is what we proposed to Carnegie, with about 20 or 40 students who would live, breathe, and eat quantum theory all day long. And then came COVID. And COVID forced us to turn around completely, pretty quickly, to do an online format, which is much less boot and more camp, I would say. It's a bit more relaxed than it might have been. And that has the usual disadvantages of any online format, but our experience the past 2 years has been very positive, and in particular because it has allowed us to reach way more people than we could have reached the other way. I'm not sure why we didn't think of doing this initially. And so this year, when we have the option, because of COVID's retreat, we have the option of going in person, we decided to stick with the virtual format because it just seems like this suits our purposes much better. But we haven't just been sitting around. We've been adding bells and whistles to the program each year. And this year, just go through these quickly, calling it Math Camp. This is what Michael and Jakub will be organizing. It's Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. So it's a 4-day workshop in the afternoon. Last year, I think there were about 40 students who hung in there the whole time and completed the camp, and they was very well reviewed. It was not easy. It's quantum math, but still it was, I think, a very positive experience. So we're repeating that camp again this year. Then we're adding a new camp to kind of match the mathematical quantitative camp. This is Natasha's camp on qualitative methods informed by Karen Barad's approach to quantum theory. And Natasha wanted to emphasize, that no background in Barad's work is necessary for the workshop. That'll be supplied in the workshop. And also to point out that because Natasha had a very huge enrollment for her workshop, and so she's divided it into 2 groups. And so there's a Monday group and a Tuesday group, and they're the same syllabus, the same curriculum and everything. So you only need to attend one. There's only 1-day camp, but it's just divided into 2 groups because of the scale. Then we have my seminar. I'll be presenting a paper, kind of a failed paper, and I'll explain about that on Wednesday when I get to it. I'd originally thought of distributing the paper in advance, and then I decided that wasn't a good idea, and I'll explain why on Wednesday. So what I'm going to do instead, since you haven't seen the paper in advance, and I wanted to avoid a 45-minute presentation. So what I'm doing is I'll do a 15-minute summary of my talk of the paper, and then I've enlisted the help of 3 faculty discussants, 2 at Ohio State and 1 outside. Morgan Liu, who's an anthropologist here at Ohio State, and he's been to both of our previous quantum camps. Then Ben McKean, who's my colleague in political science, actually political theory, and who also is a critical theorist. And then Michael Murphy, who's a postdoc at Queen's University in Canada, and has been a prolific contributor to kind of quantum IR, and has written a lot of really nice articles and actually a short book, and he's just a postdoc. So he has a lot to say as well. And then after that, there'll be at least 45 minutes, my hope. It's a 2-hour seminar. We should have at least 45 minutes for Q&A from all of you. And so that will make it much more inclusive, I guess. Let's see, is there anything else here? Oh, actually, speaking of articles or papers, as you know, they are the name of the game in the academy. And so at the camp, at camp headquarters, so to speak, we've cooked up 2 other schemes to subsidize the production of more articles of this type in order to help demonstrate the value of the approach. And so our 2 additional schemes, or bells and whistles, we have this one we're going to be doing this fall. It's a 2 best paper competitions for new investigators only, and that's defined on the website. And this would be 1 competition for best qualitative paper and 1 competition for the best quantitative paper. And the rules for eligibility and all that are on the website. And I believe the deadline is September something, and I'm drawing a blank on the actual day, but it's a few weeks from now. And just send your papers in, and the winner will get $1,000 for each of the prizes. But one thing I have to say is that if there's a lot of papers, we won't be able to give you guys comments on all the papers. There may be a few papers that we can give comments to, but you'll have to send them in figuring that you should send them in assuming that you won't get any comments, and then maybe you will get some. Okay, so that's number 4. And then the final thing we're doing is a more ambitious scheme. It's kind of crazy in a way, but it's a targeted opportunity scheme. And the idea here is to seed, S-E-E-D, seed a bunch of quantum social science articles by creating lists for different disciplines, all the major social science disciplines, of the top 5 or the top 10 articles that somebody should write about sociology or economics. Someone should write these articles because they will have a major impact on those disciplines to demonstrate the power of quantum thinking. So what we're trying to do is identify low-hanging fruit that are big impact. And so, for example, in political science, someone could write an article quantizing Arrow's paradox, Arrow's theorem, which is the foundation of social choice theory, which is right now a very classical theorem. And if you quantize that, it comes out looking very different, and its implications are very different. Another example in political science might be to quantize deterrence theory, which is, again, based on game theory. It's very classical. If you quantize deterrence theory, that might have some implications for how we think about nuclear deterrence and so on. So those are examples of the kinds of things we have in mind, high value targets that could be quantized, and then that would be a significant demonstration of the power of this kind of thinking. And I should add, this is because it's a competition, to each of these targets that we come up with, we will attach a prize, some figure of money, we'll have to figure out how much, which would be collected when somebody eventually writes a suitable paper. So there's no particular deadline on this, unlike the first competition. But at this stage, anyway, in the next few weeks, all we're looking for is ideas for target articles, which we'll collect and collate, and then probably in September sometime, we'll put together some lists. If this idea looks like it might work, we'll put together some lists, and then you'll be able to see what we have in mind and what you might try to go for. So bottom line, think about your own field over the next few days, and what kind of articles do you think your field really needs in order to overcome your own skepticism or overcome your colleagues' skepticism, but this kind of approach is worthwhile. And there's a Google form on the Bootcamp website somewhere where you can enter your suggestions. Kelly can tell you what to do about that. Okay, finally, just moving forward. Just logistics here. So each day, we have 2 parts to each day, and they have separate links. The morning has the same link for every morning of the week. The afternoon, and Kelly will correct me if I'm wrong about this, the afternoon each day has its own link. And so we have to sort of switch after we're done at 2 o'clock in the morning session. The morning format will be a webinar, which means that you can see us, but we cannot see or hear you. And it also means that you cannot ask questions directly to us. You have to write your questions down, and you should do so through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And then those questions will get to Kelly, or we have a moderator for the questions, And so I'll be kind of running the show, but we'll have Michael or Joyce probably will be reading the questions as they come in, collating them, and then when it's Q&A time in the session, they will read the questions, and then the speaker will try to answer, and so on. So that's kind of the format in the morning of how the Q&A works. And I should point out that the chat function we've disabled that, except for communicating with Kelly. So if you want to communicate with Kelly, send her something through the chat, but I don't think it will work more generally than that. So that's the morning anyway. And then the afternoons are a little bit different. They're not going to be webinars. I believe they're all seminars. Although mine might be a webinar. I'm not sure where that stands right now. There's also a two-tier structure in the sense that the afternoon will begin at 1 o'clock. There'll be a 1-hour session from 1 to 2, which is like an open discussion session. I'll host the session, but no one's presenting anything. It's really just Q&A and talking. We did it last year as an experiment. It ended up working really well, so we thought we'd repeat it again this year. And I want to say that we're encouraging our speakers to attend this 1-hour session to sort of follow up with you all after their talks. So last year, about half the speakers attended these additional sessions. The other half couldn't make it. So we'll see how many come, but there'll be some surprises. Let's see. And then at 2 o'clock, we'll start the actual workshops in the afternoon, the math camp on the one hand, and Natasha's qualitative methods on the other. And those will run until 4:30, with a break in the middle. So that's the daily structure. Then the rules. So there are no questions during the speaker's talks, but you can write questions down at any time. So you can start writing them down now, and they'll get to Kelly and so on. But we've asked all of our speakers to try to leave at least a half hour or so for Q&A after their talks, and maybe more if possible. So there should be plenty of time. Let's see, behind the scenes. Okay, I've already explained that. I would encourage you to keep your questions relatively short because we'll be reading them, so we can't read anything super long. And in the afternoon sessions, it's important in the seminar format to avoid very long interventions, speeches, diatribes, or anything like that. You want to keep your comments and questions efficient and short. The more efficient we are in asking questions, the more people will have a chance to ask one. And finally, although of course we hope that you'll attend every single session, although you can't attend the 2 afternoon sessions at the same time, but we're hoping everybody can attend everything else. But of course, we know that's not realistic. It's summertime, middle of July after all. So you should feel free to come and go as you see fit. It's an a la carte conference. We're not going to monitor you or anything like that. So I think that sort of covers it. All right, so that's what I had to cover, and that took me exactly half an hour. Kelly or Michael or Joyce, do you want to add anything before I turn it over?